Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are you? Another week, another visit to the hospital for a family member. The nurses recognize me, and I can only say that's a strange feeling. For whatever reason, the closest good ER is stacked to the gills with people needing oxygen for respiratory distress and other ailments. There were literally stretchers and beds in the hallways while we awaited treatment. It was like something out of a plague horror movie, and not a particularly good one either. As I mentioned in the last episode of Neptune Scars, I've sent off the new book to my beta reader, and I'll be speaking with my designer regarding Oceania and see if we can't get it published by second quarter this year. I do have an idea for a Raventail novel, but I have to outline this sucker and see if it'll work. I'm hopeful, though. All that said, it's time for me to get back to work. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 15 of The Black Evolution. Chapter 23. The next day, Shauna again found herself in the lab facing Poppy 1 and Tob 1. However, things were a little different now. Sarah had replaced the sergeant at the security station, and the familiar portable incinerator units had been replaced with the kind you expected to see strapped to a soldier's back. There were now 4 suited figures inside the labs instead of 2, and a few stainless steel nozzles had descended from the ceiling. Somehow Shauna didn't think they were there to spray water. After their chat yesterday, Moore must have gone into security overdrive. Ultra-paranoid level. But could Shauna blame her? Shit, hadn't she wanted to burn the things yesterday, set fire to the facility and walk the hell away? Do something to destroy M2 once and for all? Moore might be crazy, Jekyll and Hyde crazy, but at least she was taking this part seriously. M2 might destroy the humans inside the labs, but it wasn't getting out of here, unless it had been reduced to ash and flushed out the waste vents, like the leavings from a million cigarettes. "You're going to die in here too," a voice said in her mind. "Don't you know that?" Ignoring the voice, she focused on what Neil had put on the monitors. It was the security log from last night. 7 separate instances showed up on the display, and as she read them, she felt both puzzled and more afraid than ever. The first had happened just after sundown. Tob 1 sprouted more eye stalks and spidery legs before examining its prison. This time, however, it had tested the seams of the sample case by extruding a tail, affixing itself to either side of the intersection like a glob of tar, and pressing with the tail. The extreme vibration on the glass and steel surfaces triggered the sensors, and security was called to ensure the thing hadn't escaped. Tob 1 hadn't escaped the sample case, but it tested all 8 corners of the container in the same manner. The second security alert summary listed another trigger from Tob 1. More than 2 hours after it had tested the case and returned to its liquid form, 2 eye stalks rose from the pool, the black orbs spinning in dizzying revolutions. The alert ended there. No further movements. Just the summary had been enough to make her skin vibrate. When Neil ran the film loop of the extrusion, her throat burned with bile, and the overwhelming need to run filled her mind. Even though it was only a recording, she felt those dead, lifeless eyes assessing her and its surroundings like an animal desperate to get out. But she felt as though it wanted something more than simply to eat its captors. Poppy 1 began its nocturnal behaviors around the same time Tob 1 had grown eye stalks. Shortly after the team left the lab, it returned to its liquid state, reabsorbing itself into an obsidian pool. The alert summary listed an unusual 25°C temperature change lasting 3 seconds, but the chemical sensors had recorded no known toxins or unexpected compositions. The video, however, showed much more than the alert summary provided. They watched the pool bubble slightly, its surface covered in a heat haze, like fresh asphalt drying in the Texas summer sun.
"What the hell?"
Jay had said.
"Did that thing fart?"
Shauna's mouth opened and closed before she laughed. A few seconds later, the rest of the team joined her.
"I mean, what was that?" "Jay,"
Kate said.
"that was neither helpful nor scientific, but damned funny."
Jay stopped laughing.
I wasn't kidding."
Neil turned back to the monitor. A touch of the trackpad and the loop played again and again. He stepped back from the monitors and tried to cross his arms reflexively. Shauna smiled as he put them back down at his sides. Some movements were damn near impossible in the suits.
"I think you might be right,"
Neil said. Kate sighed into the mic.
"Okay, so it expels heat. We didn't detect any hydrocarbons, any CO2, nothing."
"Unless it created oxygen," Shauna said. The team went quiet. "Neil, do we have that?" He shook his head.
Apart from the actual oxygen levels inside the room, the sensors aren't calibrated or sensitive enough to pick up that small of a deviation. I mean, if it expelled some O2, it would have to be a tremendous amount to take the meters. Shit,
Jay said.
You think M2 creates oxygen? No.
Neil chuckled.
But I didn't think it farted either. Point.
Jay walked to the monitor.
Okay, so do we test that? Don't know, don't care, yet. Let's see what else it did first,
Kate said. Alert number 4 occurred when Tob 1 changed color as it reformed itself. Well, transform was a better term. It once again extruded a pseudopod that looked like a misshapen beaver tail, but as it did, the appendage's color lightened from its normal jet black, and its surface dimpled and pitted. It paused for several seconds before the pool narrowed in diameter and extruded another appendage at an angle. The tail's flat, thick base gave the creature the leverage required to press the new pseudopod against the glass. But this time, Tob 1 had positioned itself no more than a few centimeters from the glass wall, the end of the new appendage hooked and curled to a sharpened point. A few seconds passed before the tail pumped upward, and the hook swung in a vicious half circle, Tob 1's normally black surface bubbling as it took on the same texture as its tail. The sharp point glanced off the glass, crumbs of dark debris scattering over that side of the sample case. Tob 1 attacked again, and the case trembled. Tob 1 tried the same tactic for 5 minutes. When it finally stopped, the sample case's floor appeared covered in brownie crumbs, and the creature seemed to have grown smaller. It's losing mass, Shauna thought. It transformed itself, grew a muscle analog, and something like flesh, or a carapace. After its final attack, Tob 1 collapsed into liquid, spread itself thin to coat the sample case, and coalesced into a pancake. The video loop ended. It's learning, Shauna said aloud.
Learning fast.
Jay turned to Neil.
Did it come close to damaging the case?
Neil shook his head.
I don't think it has enough mass to do that, but no, it didn't. Enough to freak out the sensors, but not enough to affect the glass.
You don't know that, Shauna said. Remember what the experiments showed. We can't be sure it's not weakening the entire sample case. The team fell silent again. Shauna looked over at Tob 1. The creature's lone eye stalk followed her. Or seems to, she said to herself. Paranoia was expected, but did she really think the creature cared about who was in the room? Each of them was nothing more than a meal to the life form.
How bad are the rest of the security alerts?
Kate asked. Neil brought up the additional sensor logs. More of the same. The difference was that Poppy 1 seemed more content in its liquid state than Tob 1. The reason? Good question. Both samples were bathed in the same frequency of fluorescent light and had been kept at the same ambient temperature, so why did Tob 1 continually probe its confines, often growing limbs and other muscular pseudopods? Poppy 1, on the other hand, seemed to have given up. Shauna looked back at Poppy 1. The black liquid sat like a sheen of dirty motor oil on a metal slab. No hint of an eye stalk there, much less any other appendage. She felt Tob 1's alien stare and kept her eyes focused on Poppy 1's displays. She couldn't bear to look at that spinning, murky eye for another moment.
So now what?
Jay asked. Kate pored over the reports and looked back at their tests.
We'll have to destroy them quite soon,
she said.
So what do we want to do? Bisection? I'm in favor of that,
Neil said.
We'll slice them down the middle like we did with the small samples. See if the smaller specimens can still manifest physical attributes. I swear,
Jay said.
When you speak like that, I question if you've ever been laid. Only by your mom,
Neil said.
Oh, ha ha. And yours wears combat boots.
Bisection, Shauna said, ignoring their repartee. What do we do if they don't respond? Kate sighed heavily.
Then we'll try something else.
Something else? Like what? Feed them radioactive waste? Or maybe insects from the fields? What? Neil and Kate had already begun prepping for the next round of physical tests. Another bisection would require Neil, Kate, and Shauna to enter the lab and use the partitions built into the sample cases to effectively split the samples, creating 4 of the creatures from the 2 already in the containers. 4 of them. The plus side? They wouldn't be half as large as they were now. But 4 of them? She imagined the partitioned sample cases, the things inside all staring at her with those dead, disinterested, spinning orbs.
Shauna?
The voice made her flinch. Inside the pressurized helmet, she couldn't hear where the sound had come from. She shook away the clenching fear that had grasped her. Yeah, Kate?
You okay?
Why wouldn't I be? The moment she said the words, she realized she had said them between pants.
You need a break?
Jay asked. I'm fine, Shauna said, desperate to keep the tremor from her voice.
We ready?
Jay sighed through the comms.
Is there such a thing?
Shauna glanced up at the monitor feeds displaying the inside of the lab. All those angles, all those lights, all those safety precautions. Now they'd have to put them to the test. Ready. Chapter 24. It was Shauna's first time in the lab since they'd infected the rats. Her pressure suit muffled the sounds as though they were coming through the walls of a thinly insulated apartment. More like a dorm room, Shauna thought. She, Neil, and Kate left the airlock and entered the testing lab. Even with 4 meters of distance between her and the entities, Shauna felt too close. Way too close. It was one thing to be on the other side of a thick glass and steel partition, and quite another to only be protected by the UV lights and the sample case enclosures. Shauna stared through the window and into the diagnostic area beyond. The 2 soldiers with their incinerators stood still as statues, their eyes scanning the lab for anything out of the ordinary. They made her nervous, too. If something happened, what would keep them from running inside the lab and torching the scientists as well as the creatures? Hell, why bother with that when you could just use the nuclear option and flood the lab with killing fire?
Okay,
Jay said.
Poppy 1 is pretty chill.
Neil snorted.
How did an old fart like you come up with that one? Nephew,
Jay said.
I think you can split Poppy 1 without manually adjusting its position.
The heavy pressure suit was more than a little warm inside, but now it seemed as though her skin had been covered in ice. The last 4 words Jay had spoken were enough to conjure some pretty damned ugly images. She slowed her pace, allowing Kate and Neil the first crack at Poppy 1's sample case. When they reached it, Shauna sidestepped for a better view. Jay had been right. Poppy 1 lay more or less in the middle of the sample case. Just as they had cleaved the first samples to create clones, they drop a partition and separate the liquid, effectively creating 2 creatures. Kate moved to perform the process on Poppy 1, but Neil moved in her way.
I've got it,
Neil said.
Ah,
Kate said.
Saving the little old lady? Hardly. You're neither little nor old. Just thinking of Maeve, that's all.
The comms went dead silent. Neil stood for a moment as though chastising himself for having given voice to the thoughts. Finally, he said,
Here we go,
and turned back to the sample case. Shauna watched as he pulled the safety release and slid the partition down. When the metal and glass came within a few centimeters of the pool, it began bubbling.
Shit,
Jay said.
Neil, slam it home, now.
Just as tendrils of black, no thicker than filaments, rose from the pool, their ends reaching for the partition, Neil dropped it and hit the control to fasten it into place. The pool erupted in shudders and bubbles. The poppy creatures continued exploring the new obstruction with pseudopods for a moment before finally retracting them. The puddle of M2 slowly oozed to the center of its new confines, its twin doing the same.
What the hell?
Jay asked.
I saw it too,
Kate said.
They both responded in the same fashion. So?
Neil gestured at the case.
Probably just an instinctual response if both displayed the same behavior.
Shauna shook her head. I don't think so, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a clone. Hell, it's not even a clone. It's just the same creature cut into 2 pieces. The real question is whether or not the 2 creatures share the same memories.
Memories?
Kate said.
Are you suggesting these things are capable of memory?
Why not? Shauna said. If you can condition a creature, it remembers. Hell, you can even condition a plant to grow more vertically by cutting off the longest limbs. A tree doesn't have memory, but it can be conditioned.
No,
Neil said.
Conditioning is not memory.
Shauna smiled despite herself. Then a dog remembers, but a plant doesn't.
Children,
Kate said.
Can we go ahead and handle Top 1 so we can get out of here? Oh, right.
He stood over the sample case, his eyes examining the locking mechanisms and the status lights. The case was secure, or as secure as possible, with M2 inside. While Kate stayed near the poppies, Shauna moved to the side of the Top 1 sample case. She diverted her gaze as long as she could, but a twitch of movement caught her attention. A black, spinning orb on the end of a malformed, hooked eye stalk stared at her. For a moment, she forgot there was a wall of glass and steel between her and the creature. Its alien stare froze her thoughts, and time dragged on while she stared into a void.
Shauna?
Neil's voice was far away, but he was asking her something. She wanted to care, but didn't. The alien appendage and eye came closer. The darkness in the creature's orb beckoned and called to her. Sleep. Silence. Still, the orb in its void came closer until she felt like she was drowning.
Shauna!
The voice was so far away that she didn't even know whose it was. Didn't care either. She was listening for something in the dead silence, something that would speak to her in a language she could understand. The void before her disappeared, replaced with blinding white light. She stumbled backward and nearly fell before someone caught her.
Neil, get her out of here!
Kate was yelling. Where was she? Where had she been? She blinked rapidly as she tried to clear the terrible afterimage, her retinas practically burning from the light. Neil?
Yes, I've got you. Can you stand?
Could she? Why was he asking that? She looked down and her vision cleared. She'd been staring directly into the light array above her. Where? The dizziness faded, leaving her breathing rapidly but also feeling more stable. She pushed forward slightly, regained her balance, and stood on her own. Kate stood near the panic button on the wall, her hand hovering mere centimeters from its glowing red surface. Why? Shauna surveyed the room and saw the top one sample case. Its stand had moved slightly, as though pushed. Instead of being flush with the observation window, it now canted a few centimeters toward the wall. She pointed at the case, the confusion giving way to unease. What happened?
Are you okay?
Neil asked. Shauna nodded. I'm here. What happened?
You tell me,
Kate said.
because I don't know what the hell you were doing.
The anger in her voice made Shauna turn to face her. A team leader had moved her hand away from the panic button, but remained within reach. Shauna caught motion through the window and looked over. The two soldiers with incinerators were no longer standing in their positions. The pair had moved to the airlock, while two new arrivals took positions on either side of the experimentation lab. What happened? Shauna said.
You don't remember?
She turned to face Neil. Remember what? I don't understand.
It's okay, Shauna.
Jay said over the radio.
What's the last thing you remember?
She swallowed hard. I saw Top One. It was looking at me and... She stopped again. How could she put it into words? It was a delusion, something Lovecraft might have dreamt up. Hell, she didn't want to remember it. It had just been the vision of a void, nothing more. I don't know.
Well?
Neil said with a long sigh.
You put your helmet right up against the case and started pushing it.
Shauna felt as though she'd been punched. I did what?
Yeah,
Kate said.
that's what you did.
Why? I mean...
Shauna,
Jay said.
why don't you come back out here with me? Yeah,
Neil said.
probably a good idea. You might want to take a break.
A break? She said dumbly. Look, I just...
Shauna,
Kate said.
please take a break.
The tone of Kate's voice was that of a mother's, plaintive and resigned at the same time. Shauna's mother had used that tone whenever her daughter made a mess by pure accident or simply had the misfortune to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the meaning of the words was simple enough. You are forgiven, but I need you to leave. Okay, Shauna said, a flush of shame lighting her cheeks as she walked to the airlock. Stuck inside the suit, there was no way to wipe away the tears. Bleary-eyed, she went through the airlock, a soldier following too close behind her. A few minutes later, she removed her suit and prepared to leave the lab enclosure.
Shauna,
Moore's voice said over the airlock's intercom.
please join me in the commissary when you are ready.
Shauna stared up at the all-too-visible security camera in the corner. Moore was watching her. Hell, the entire facility staff were probably watching her. She'd no doubt that when she stepped into the corridor, another soldier would be waiting to greet her. Maybe even Sarah. Instead of giving the camera the finger, she shrugged her shoulders and nodded to it. She paused at the airlock door, her shaking hand mere centimeters away from the cycle button. This was it. She'd fucked up. She'd lost her shit, put everyone in jeopardy, and Moore was going to fire her, as in termination of employment, which in this case might mean something a little more ominous than a pink slip. She wiped away another tear, composed herself, and pressed the button. No soldier waited for her in the corridor. The area seemed completely empty. She stepped out of the lab facility and into the wide-open area. Sarah waved to her from the security station. Breath shuddering, Shauna fought to wave back. She waited for Sarah to beckon her, but the woman didn't. Instead, she'd already turned her attention back to the security monitors and was talking in a low voice with a security minion. Without making eye contact, Shauna slipped through the last pair of security doors and into the elevator. While it rose, all the possible ramifications of what had happened whirled and flooded her mind with 1,000 different narratives, all of them bad. When the elevator doors opened, she paused before lifting her eyes to see who was there to greet her. There was no one. Her skin tingled with anxiety. Had the crazy bitch told everyone to get off the floor so she could kill Shauna in private? Shauna made her way around the corridor and to the foyer. Next to the commissary door, a standing sign announced, "Closed until 1500. That feeling of unease more or less took over every other sensation. She took the last 5 steps slowly and deliberately, stealing herself rather a bullet or a pair of handcuffs. Before she had a chance to chicken out, she pulled. The door swung wide on the well-lit commissary dining room. The chef hadn't yet placed any food on the counters, but she noticed another carafe of hot chocolate with a sticker noting it had been brewed 5 minutes ago. The bad feeling melted into confusion. "Shauna?" She didn't jump at the sound, but froze instead. Moore's voice had a strange quality to it. It didn't have its usual false, polite tone. Instead, it was more of a mother calling to a child. Shauna turned and found Moore sitting at one of the smaller tables. Apart from her, the dining room was empty. "Hi," Shauna managed, although it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Why don't you get a drink and come join me?" Shauna did her best to keep her voice level, but it shook anyway. "Am I going to get a chance to drink it?" Moore's friendly expression wrinkled into confusion fast enough to look genuine, although Shauna wasn't certain there was anything genuine about the woman. "Please, I want to talk to you about what happened, because I don't think you explained it." Moore gestured at the floor. "I certainly don't think your team was in the mood to try and understand, either." "That's for sure," Shauna said, sounding like Eeyore. "Not like I could have expected anything else." Moore cleared her throat. "Shauna, I'd rather not be shouting at you. Get a drink and join me." The strange woman dropped her eyes to the table, an index finger sliding over her tablet. Shauna stood there for a moment, not quite sure what to do. Finally, feeling awkward and paranoid, she filled a cup and dressed it the way she liked. By the time she reached Moore, the woman had already finished her own. Moore looked up from the tablet, a sad smile on her face. "The rain's going to get worse," she said. "Canada won't shut the door." Shauna chuckled. "I haven't been in cool weather in a long time," she said. "Not since I was in Norway." "Not surprised. You were rig hopping and lab hopping all over Africa and East Asia. Not many of those places have a real winter." "At least not when we were there," she said. "No." The pause lingered between them, each second making it more awkward to break the silence. Finally, Moore said, "Tell me what happened." Shauna stared down at the hot chocolate. She was glad it wasn't coffee. She wasn't sure she could look into a black liquid again without shivering. "I went to hold the stand for Neil and, well," she fought to put it into words. It sounded so ridiculous now, but it wasn't. "I looked at it, made eye contact." She slowly shook her head. "It's like it was looking back at me, studying me, assessing me, and I just got lost in its stare. It just kept getting bigger and bigger and—" Shauna was silent for a moment. "It's like it was trying to speak." Moore's face paled. "Trying to speak." Shauna laughed nervously. "I know, it sounds ridiculous?" Moore asked. "My dear, with all the surveillance films you've seen, as well as your own experience, don't you think it's, at the very least, an intelligent creature?" "Of course," Shauna said. "Well, Tob much more than Poppy." "Exactly," Moore said. "Poppy has seemed to act more on instinct rather than working puzzles. I think the records from Ben Tob make it quite clear that Tob was at least as intelligent as a dog. Perhaps much more so." "And dogs speak to us in a different language," Shauna said. Moore grinned. "Right. The difference between M2 and a dog is a bit vast, but I grant you your point," Shauna said. "Good. Is this the first time this has happened?" "No," Shauna said, remembering the day before when she'd felt Tob once stare as if it were making physical contact with her. "It was watching me all day yesterday, and this morning." "Is it the same feeling?" "Yes and no," Shauna said. "This time in the lab, much more powerful." "Interesting. No one else has mentioned this." "Why would they? I must be the only crazy one." Moore sighed, wiped her face, and stared into her empty cup. To Shauna, it looked like the woman had been trying to fight back tears. "You're not," she said. "You're not crazy." "What is with you, Moore?" Shauna said. "I read and heard the transcripts of you talking with HAL and Ben Tob. I know how you sounded. Emotionless, robotic, detached professionalism. I get it, but you're not doing that now. You've become Jekyll and Hyde. Moore wiped at her face again before looking up. Shauna had been right. The bitch was at least pretending to be on the verge of a breakdown. I know, she said. You've seen the containments. Yes. Then you know you can see them through the glass, as if they were in a terrarium. Her voice trailed off and her eyes had become slightly unfocused. The first few days Poppy and Tob were here, we fought like hell to keep them from getting out. Based on our observations, we contained them the best we could with what was available. We had to evacuate the creatures immediately, you understand. Shauna said nothing. The longer we waited, the more of a chance something else could happen. More lives lost, more damage, more threat. Moore picked up her cup as if to sip and rolled it between her hands instead. I supervised the transport. I supervised the move-in to this facility. We did the best we could with what we knew, but it wasn't enough. She made eye contact with Shauna. And now everything is inevitable. But you're prepared. Yes, Moore said. But as I've thought and heard since we discovered him too, the word impossible has lost all meaning, and that means every precaution is suspect, as is every data point we've gathered and everything we think we know. And based on what I've seen this week, we need to destroy them. Shauna blinked at the woman. Had she really just said that? You want to destroy them. It wasn't a question. Moore rolled the empty mug from one hand to the next, the glass scraping across the wood with a whisper. I've always wanted to destroy them. Moore's eyes glittered with something close to madness. Ever since I saw what they can do. Then why? Why all this? Shauna raised her hands to encompass the facility. Why didn't you just set the things on fire to begin with? Moore's throat clicked as she swallowed hard. Shauna thought the woman had been on the verge of saying something before thinking better of it. I had no choice. Shauna leaned back in her chair. You're in charge. Moore smiled. Shauna knew it was genuine merely because of the futility in it. In charge doesn't mean in control, and no, I will not elaborate. I've already said too much. Who is in control? Moore looked away to study the hall. No one you know, she said at last. Doesn't matter. She wiped her sleeve across her damp forehead. M2 will be destroyed. The only question is when. How about now? Shauna said. No, not yet. Do you realize how schizo you sound right now? Shauna dropped her mug to the table hard enough for a tendril of brown liquid to fly over the side. Make up your mind before we're all fucking dead. Not yet. Moore's smile had disappeared, her eyes hard as diamonds. She stood from the table and grabbed her tablet. Soon. She took a few steps toward the door before turning. Do you feel you can continue? Shauna blinked. Her brain had been turning over Moore's behavior and what she'd said, trying to find some coded meaning. What? Do you feel well enough to go back to the lab? The word yes immediately leaped into her mind, but she kept herself from saying it. Could she? I think so, but I'm not going back inside the experiment lab. I'm glad to hear you say that. I'll alert Kate that you're coming back down. Thank you, Shauna said. Moore pointed at Shauna's mug. Finish that, maybe get another, or take one to Miss... She blushed and rolled her eyes. Catfish. She turned and left the room without another word. Shauna remained looking out the door for some time. When she finally took another sip from the drink, she found it had gone cold. She swung her gaze to the industrial-sized thermos on the serving table. Another hot chocolate? Why not? And yes, she'd bring Catfish one too. The disposable 350-milliliter lidded cups would keep both drinks nice and toasty. As she poured the liquid into the cups, Moore's words echoed in her mind. Soon. What the hell did that mean? More importantly, had the woman lost her mind? She certainly seemed close to it at the very least. For the first time in over a week, Shauna wondered who was really in control of this project. She'd always assumed it was Moore. Hell, they were told it was Moore, but that didn't add up either. The woman appeared to want to answer Shauna's questions, but hadn't been able to bring herself to do so. Ears, Shauna said aloud. Ears and eyes. Moore might be watched as closely as the rest of the facility personnel. Maybe even more so. But by whom? Catfish called the facility a black site, like the compounds the CIA used for storing terrorists, compromised assets, and other human beings that were never to see the light of day again. The description was close. The difference being, of course, human terrorists couldn't eat the whole damn world. M2 wasn't an invading army or made up of individuals who'd been indoctrinated with extremist ideologies. It was a creature, an intelligent one. While it might not be as smart as a human being, it could solve problems and was insanely dangerous to biological tissues. This so-called black site was little more than a container for M2, a rigged inferno waiting for someone to pull the lever and incinerate everything. And here we are, waiting for it to happen, she thought, and just as vulnerable to the solution as the problem. Shauna finished fixing her cup of hot chocolate and started on catfishes. As she held the cup, she realized her hand was shaking. Gritting her teeth, she willed it to steady. It didn't want to cooperate, but did so anyway, grudgingly. When she finished affixing the lid, she walked out of the empty commissary, holding the 2 cups in her hand. The facility seemed completely devoid of human presence, apart from her own, but she knew that was bullshit. Soldiers hid somewhere, watching, waiting, and hopefully less terrified than she was. As she walked to the elevator, her eyes kept swinging to look at the cameras embedded in the ceiling. They were watching her. They were watching everything. The only question was, who were they?